Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Descartes, Montaigne, and skepticism. Now I'm really excited for the videos this week because this is us really dipping our toes into Descartes. Descartes is a major figure in the history of early modern philosophy. He is so foundationally important that most philosophers would identify the beginning of the period of early modern philosophy to be Descartes. And for reasons that I hope will be somewhat clear by the end of this video, Descartes is considered one of the foremost foundational philosophers in the entire Western canon. So Descartes is extremely important, and he's a smart guy. And it's even better that the Meditations, the short text that we're going to be reading in this class, is really only 60 pages long. So it's quite easy to have read really monumentally great work in the history of early modern philosophy, and to do so relatively quickly. Our goal over the next few weeks is to really run through this text and do so in enough detail that you can feel that you have a real, genuine understanding of this book, why it includes the parts that it does, how it's written, and hopefully you'll have some views about aspects of Descartes' philosophical system that you agree with, aspects that you disagree with, and so on. Descartes is going to be especially important for what we do in the future because virtually all of the early modern philosophy and philosophers that we're going to be discussing are going to involve some kind of reaction to Descartes. Sometimes it's going to be more positive and they're going to take on whole aspects of Descartes' worldview wholesale, right? Other times, it will be as a kind of reaction to Descartes. They'll think that Descartes made some central error at some point in the text and want to explore alternative philosophical possibilities, and so on. That's really just to say that the more we really nail down Descartes and understand Descartes, the easier the rest of the whole tradition of early modern philosophy is going to be. But you might have noticed that in today's video, we're not only talking about Descartes, we're also talking about Montaigne. This short segment I had you read about the inadequacy of the senses. Now, Montaigne, I think most people would say, is actually a pre-modern philosopher. So Descartes, as we said earlier, was the first modern philosopher, or at least is often thought of as being the first modern philosopher. Montaigne wrote before Descartes, and so Montaigne is sort of a pre-modern philosopher. So that might raise the question, well, why are we reading this in our class where we're interested not in pre-modern philosophy, but in modern philosophy? Well, I'm having us read this in combination with a Descartes because I think that in a way these texts are superficially similar but deeply different than one another, right? And we're going to get both parts of that. How are they superficially similar to one another? Well, they're superficially similar to one another in that they each propose a certain kind of general skeptical attitude, especially as regards the senses, right? Our sensory organs, our eyes, ears, mouth, skin, and so on, right? Nose. And so both Montaigne and Descartes invoke kind of skeptical arguments against the reliability of the findings of the senses. And at a certain point, they even make virtually identical arguments as to why you can't always trust your senses. But the way that they're really deeply different from one another, notwithstanding, is the purpose of their skepticism. Right? So they're both skeptical about, I would say, the common sense view that our general sensory apparatus is like reliable way of coming to know the truth. But what their skepticism does within their philosophies is really quite radically different. So let's get into it. Let's start out with some of Montaigne's arguments. I've written these up here just drew them as little circles. As we're going to see, these arguments are a little bit more scattershot. They're a little bit less, I think you can say, architecturally related to each other. And by that I mean that Descartes' arguments involve a kind of progression, whereas Montaigne sort of brings up every argument under the book that he can think of to make his point. And let's run through a few of these arguments. Montaigne is a skeptical philosopher, and what that means is that he's following the tradition, the ancient Greek tradition of skepticism. Now, one thing that's really interesting about skepticism that will certainly inflect how we approach the history of early modern philosophy is that in the ancient Greek world, skepticism was not very popular. It was not considered a really, popular, worthwhile philosophy by the vast majority of ancient Greeks. They didn't find it very compelling on the whole. We have way more texts that are, like, for example, Stoic than we do that are skeptical and so on. But it's kind of interesting because although the ancient Greek skeptics were not very popular or successful, really, in finding converts during the period in which it was written, roughly 2,000 some years ago, they did find a new audience in the beginning of the modern period, maybe a little bit before the start of the modern period, where there was kind of like a modern rediscovery of this tradition. And philosophers in the modern period were willing to take a lot of their arguments a lot more seriously than their fellow ancient Greeks were willing to take them seriously. And so a lot of the arguments that Montaigne ends up proposing in this short fragment are also arguments that we can see come up in that ancient Greek skeptical tradition. Now, in general, what this philosophical tradition was aiming at is they were trying to demote our confidence that we can come to know the truth about certain kinds of philosophical matters. That's what you're skeptical about, right? Skepticism is the propensity to doubt, right? And so skepticism is often concerned with undermining reasons for belief. So oftentimes skeptical arguments are pointed at what they would say is our naive preconception that we have the ability to kind of do philosophy in the mode of Stoic or Platonic philosophy or whatever, and go, bam, I've discovered the truth, right? Now, why did they think that? Well, what they would point to, for example, is the intractability of philosophical disagreement. I mean, we've been talking about this philosophy stuff for like a really long time. It seems like we haven't really made progress in resolving any major philosophical question. And the best we've done is seen that certain kinds of philosophical questions are badly posed. And so they would infer from that, well, you shouldn't be so confident that now you've found the truth, right? That now you can be so certain of your own views, right? And a lot of their other arguments have to do with the variability and changeability of our perception, right? They point out several features of our perception. Namely, that our sensory capacities change, right? So like if you're drunk, for example, you perceive and understand the world differently than if you're sober, right? Similarly, there are certain circumstances in which our perceptions are illusory, right? If you want a cool example of this that you can do at home, get a glass of water, fill it up at least halfway or so, drop a pen in there, and as you look at the pen through the water, the pen will appear to bend, right? But if you take the pen out of the water, you can see that in fact, of course, the water did not bend the pen, right? This is a case where our visual perception becomes distorted in some way. And there are very, very many other illusions besides this. One major illusion that, of course, later Descartes would be concerned with is the illusion that the sun orbits the Earth, right? That's something that people believed for a very, very long time. In a sort of like naive pre-scientific view, it tends to be what people believe, right? Similarly to the moon. However, when you get better astronomical models, you'll see, in fact, that that's not the case, right? And what this really points to is a kind of weakness or inadequacy in our senses, right? Think about my own visual perception as compared with, for example, a microscope, right? I can't see the fine level of detail that a microscope can see. And similarly, a microscope can't do the sort of things that I can do in my everyday visual perception, right? If I had the equivalent of magnifying glass spectacles, I would have a very hard time getting around the world, right? And so our senses are finite in that they have certain limited kinds of capacities, right? And that's part of what's on display with illusions. Moreover, our senses sometimes conflict, right? Something can, for example, look like it's going to taste really good, it can smell really good, and then you taste it and it's not very good, right? You can get conflicting reports from your different sensory apparatuses. And quite along those lines, we don't have all of the perceptual capabilities that other animals have. So, for example, bats navigate via echolocation, right? And human beings don't do that. What all of this does is this points to the forever limited and partial nature of sensory perception. Sensory perception is, by its nature, finite. It can only reveal some aspect of the world, right? You don't get the entirety of the world, right? You only get one point of view on it, as it were. Now, what does Montaigne conclude from this? Well, I would describe Montaigne's skepticism as a religious, empiricist kind of skepticism, right? What do I mean by that? Well, I say religious because what Montaigne is ultimately going to conclude from his skeptical arguments is that the human capacity for knowledge is very limited, and so we should rely on someone else that knows better, aka God, right? Someone who can know without having this very inadequate sensory perceptual model of coming to know the world, right? And he's also empiricist in the sense that, and empiricism is a word that's going to come up a lot in our class. Empiricism is the view that the most foundational aspects of our knowledge come from sensory perceptual experience, right? So hopefully you can see how these two beliefs come together. Montaigne wants to argue that our only source of foundational knowledge is our sensory perception. And then he also wants to say, and our sensory perception is inadequate in several ways, right? It is not perfect in any respect. And so that should lead you to a kind of religious viewpoint, right? It should lead you to lend credence to someone who knows the world better, aka God, right? And so what Montaigne sort of learns by doing his skeptical philosophy is that philosophy is pretentious and it claims to know but cannot really know, and hence you have the reliance on traditional religious authorities. Now, as I mentioned, Descartes is going to use very similar, in some cases the same arguments, but it's going to put them to a radically different purpose. It's important to take a minute just to highlight how important heliocentrism was for Descartes. So heliocentrism is just a model of the solar system whereby the objects in the solar system orbit the sun, right? As opposed to geocentrism, which is the theory that the orbits of the solar system or the planets of our solar system orbit the Earth, right? What this showed for Descartes was that if such a core foundational belief, such as the Earth's place within the universe, could be wrong, right? Something that is so foundational, something that Descartes has based so much of his knowledge up to this point upon could just be false, that the entire edifice of our knowledge might also be false. And so Descartes thinks that what we need to do is we need to build new foundations. So all of those old beliefs, anything that we can even conceivably, possibly doubt, we need to throw out so that we know that what we're building on when we're building our knowledge is something real and reliable. So, as we're going to see in more detail in just a moment, Descartes has a methodological skepticism. What does that mean? Well, it means that Descartes is going to be skeptical of any belief that he can even possibly doubt, right? So that he can come to discover a truth that he can be absolutely certain with respect to. So Descartes is, in a way, a skeptical philosopher. He is examining various reasons for why we might doubt things that in a sort of pre-philosophical mode we don't think to doubt. However, his skepticism is not his conclusion, but it's how he arrives. In other words, Descartes is not going to leave his philosophical system as a skeptic in the way that Montaigne did. Descartes instead is going to use skepticism as a tool to discover the truth, right? It's his method in the Meditations. Now, Descartes presents three arguments in the first meditation that for him completely decimates the entire system of knowledge that he had up to that point, right? The first point that he makes is about illusion, which is that our sensory perceptual capacities are prone to illusion. That's what the pen in the water example demonstrates. That's what we learn by, for example, seeing a reflection of something in water, right? That's another example of something that's an illusion, right? All of this points to the fact that, well, if I could have seen something and I could have believed that it was real and later discovered it to be an illusion, then so too the things that I think now are real ultimately might come to be just illusions. And so this leads Descartes to doubt anything that he learns from experience, right? Of the sensory perceptual capacities that we were examining earlier. Now, Descartes is a little bit different from Montaigne in that he thinks at this point we can still be certain about what we could call a priori or rational truths. So like mathematics, right? I don't learn mathematics by like going out into the world and doing experiments and making discoveries or something like that, the way that I might in, for example, biology. Instead, the way that I come to learn things in mathematics is through an examination of the concepts, right? I, in a way, am clarifying, at least according to these authors, my concepts of number whenever I do mathematics, right? So in other words, their point is, okay, we all learned, for example, that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It might have been the case that you were occasioned to learn that. In other words, the set of circumstances wherein you thought about it were empirical, right? So like you were in first grade or whatever, and you learned in Mrs. Smith's class that this was, that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? But learning it at Mrs. Smith's class isn't the reason 2 plus 2 is 4, right? That's just the occasion under which you learn this. Anyone before or after could have learned the same fact. So what Descartes and thinkers like him conclude from that is that when we learn mathematical truths, we're learning in a purely rational way, in the way that, like, I don't need to use any of my sensory perceptual capacities at all to know, whether the number 10 quadrillion is divisible by 2, right? Even if I've never thought of that example before, I can discover it without using any of my sensory perceptual capacities. Now, quite similarly, and this is one of the most famous parts of Descartes' meditations, is that Descartes then extrapolates from his illusion argument to say, okay, well, do you want a good example of a sensory perceptual experience that we have that we later discover is an illusion? Well, dreams, right? When you're in a dream, at least for the most part, most people do not experience dreams and at the same time are aware that they are within a dream, right? It's only later upon waking up that you can then retroactively come to understand your dream and say, okay, yes, I understand now that all of that was not real, right? And so Descartes entertains the thesis, well, if we're just looking at any reason to doubt anything, what if all of my experience up to this point was a dream, right? You might have heard of this idea kind of explored in various science fiction media. So, for example, Blade Runner is a movie slash short story wherein people have replicated memories, for example. So they very vividly remember various things, but those memories were implanted in them, right? They weren't real memories. Similarly, The Matrix, for example, explores the idea that our everyday world is sort of an illusion, right? It's a world generated by, artificial intelligence or robots or whatever, and they're using us as human batteries and so on, right? But the general idea is just this. In the same way that when I wake up from a dream, I come to know that the experiences that I was having for like roughly the last 8 hours or something like that were illusory, so too it's conceivable, at least in principle, that we could wake up and discover our entire prior life was an illusion in just that very same way. The dream argument also produces skepticism about experience, but a dream can't make 2 plus 2 not equal 4. Now, this is where we get into the final and most powerful skeptical argument that Descartes presents, which is what is called his evil genius or evil demon argument. Now, Descartes, at this point in the meditation, asks us to imagine a creature like God and its capacities, but who willed, for one reason or another, to deceive us, right? So Descartes doesn't think that God is a deceiver, but he wants to say, okay, but I haven't yet discovered that it's impossible that there be a creature like God, call it the evil genius or the evil demon or the devil or what have you, that is hell-bent on deceiving me. This would mean not only that all of my experiences are unreliable, but even my calculations are unreliable, right? It's like as if you were trying to do a long math equation and someone kept making you forget what you were doing while you were calculating, right? In other words, the evil genius, because of his omnipotent power, has the capacity to make us skeptical even about what Descartes previously thought was immune to skepticism, namely the discoveries of like mathematics and geometry. This leads to what I previously termed Descartes' methodological skepticism. At the end of the first meditations, at the first meditation, Descartes is distraught, right? He thinks that he has now decimated all of the available knowledge, right? Nothing in mathematics or physics, right? Mathematics is a priori or purely rational evidence. That's taken out by the evil genius. Nothing about physics or anything like that. Those are taken out by the illusion and dream arguments. So it seems like the entire edifice of human knowledge is gone. And at this point, at the end of the first meditation, Descartes despairs that he will doubt everything, right? That ultimately nothing will turn out to be true, and then he will be an even more radical skeptic than Montaigne was. However, Descartes does not leave himself in despair for very long, because at the beginning of the second meditation, Descartes discovers what can finally conquer all of the skeptical arguments that he's presented up to this point, an unshakable foundation for the new system of knowledge that he will call the cogito. We'll discuss that in our next video. Thanks so much. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.